And we're live. Hi, I'm Cindy Lou with CHRO Partners. I'm joined today with Billy Parsons, and we'll have Billy tell you a little bit about his background in a minute. So we've got an exciting episode for you today. We're going to talk about this project we've been working on called the CHRO Objections Playbook. And how this came up is I spent years learning under a CEO who worked at GE, and he had the most amazing objection handling playbook for our salespeople, right? And he used to say, objections aren't just, they're not a put off in most cases. They're just asking more questions. They want to know more about what you're selling or whatever you're trying to pitch. And I started thinking about HR, and I'm like, wow, we get a lot of pushback, don't we, Billy? On projects.
Yep.
So today we're going to talk about 2 of the 10 segments in the CHRO Objections Handling Playbook. We're going to talk about talent acquisition and career pathing under talent management. But before we get started, Billy, feel free to share with the audience a little bit about your background. And if you're just joining us now, feel free to say hello and tell us where you're viewing from today.
Yeah,
Billy, over to
you. Welcome everybody, whoever's joined, and thank you to Cindy for the invite. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my background experience, which is probably very similar to a lot of people who've joined us. As far as my background, I've been in healthcare for the last 15 years in leadership roles, obviously for the last 15 years as well. Been in the C-suite for the last 10 years, and started in hospitals, and eventually moved on to roll-ups, dermatology, eye care, and lots of M&A, lots of cleanup of M&A, and I consider one of my stronger suits process improvement, along with culture building.
I would agree with that. I think you're part CHRO, part COO. So definitely have that. I think you're I've never seen anybody do M&A with such ease. It's okay, well, you're not an employee of this company anymore. Just click on this link and now you're going to be completely moved over. So usually people are pulling their hair out, and you just handled it with such grace. So it's great to have you on the show. All right, so let's first talk about the recruiting engine, talent acquisition engine. There are so many organizations that I've met who the executive team is you know what, we don't really want to have the headcount. We don't want to have, an in-house recruiting function because, the recruiting is up and down, right? And we don't really know what's coming. We think that search firms have, deeper databases. I'm like, well, guess what? The internet just leveled that playing field, right? The minute LinkedIn came on, and today especially, it's with AI, the playing field is level, so people are out there. But there's a lot of pushback, and I think that I'm preaching to the choir here, but there's opportunities for organizations to look at this differently. And so, Billy, I'd love for you to share some of your thoughts on when an executive team, CFO, whoever says, look, we don't need an in-house recruiter, or we don't need an in-house recruiting function. Obviously you have to dig in and get some context behind that, but what's your take on that?
Well, a lot of times that obviously is the size and scope and life cycle of the organization. If it's a startup, that's a tougher sell because there's so many other needs. At the same time, everyone's wearing 15 hats. When you have a mid-level company, you've built out a decent HR department, good size, you're meeting the needs, probably transactional. And once you get past the transactional stage and you're actually providing real value and strategic support, a lot of times the TA function is absolutely essential for a variety of reasons. But you do have an uphill battle sometimes when you go from small to mid, because they're so used to having on-demand, on-pay recruitment that it's hard to let go of that. Some of it is cultural. Some of it is additional biases based on who the leader is, who's asking for it.
Yeah, I would say sometimes until they're feeling enough pain. So, the sometimes it's not a cost issue either. I had a CEO, this was a company where we were the fastest growing company one year, privately held company in 2000, long time ago. But it wasn't until we were missing revenue that it was like, hey, we need something that internally, right, that we can control, because using all these search firms wasn't working for us. And even though they were willing to pay the fees, it just wasn't scaling for us. What are some stories that you might have, Billy, around the pushback that you've heard?
Well, some of it is, like you mentioned, scalability. It's really hard to scale to M&A, to even organic growth, if you don't have the team ready with not only the talent that's accessible, but the individual needs and the context necessary for what were the fills, what are the future needs, and sometimes the specialized needs. And sometimes an external firm cannot easily understand the internal pressures you have to fill certain roles. And there's nuance to many of these roles. It's not simply a cut and paste from one to the next. Sometimes there are specialized needs that have to be filled.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say hello to Peyton Hutto. Thank you for joining us from Dallas, Peyton. I think that the issue is sometimes recruitment, if it's not a true headhunting organization in-house as well, if they're overloaded with too many recs, right, then all they can do is sort of push paper, so to speak. And so the internal leaders might not feel like they're getting the same kind of candidates, right, as an external search firm. And so I think having the right level of of recs per recruiter makes a big difference too. So the CHRO, if you guys can be guardians of their time, I think that also helps to actually produce a headhunting kind of service in-house.
Yeah, and like I was mentioning, you're exactly right. Like I was mentioning, sometimes there are specialty roles, and you have a team, you have a center of excellence talent acquisition team, but sometimes you have specialized needs. Like, for instance, when I worked for U.S. Dermatology Partners, we had a specialized physician recruitment team that was outside the bounds of all of our other clinical needs, because that was vastly different.
Right.
And I also had, we had specialized positions for estheticians, and those are tougher to find. The need is a little bit more specialized. So I had a very special in-house headhunter just for estheticians.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Especially if that is a revenue producing role, like for you to say, hey, we're just going to hand this out. First of all, you're eroding all your margins. And, I'm laughing because I used to actually be in the recruiting business, right? I mean, the reason we were in that business is because companies couldn't get it right internally. And the ones that could, we were like, well, they don't really need our help. So I think that if you can speak the language of the business, which is we're missing revenue opportunities, we're missing margin, from a culture perspective, right?
Right.
It seems like the in-house recruiters should be able to be more targeted in that perspective. Now, go ahead.
No, you're right. And plus the delay in hiring, sometimes you're at the mercy externally of their timeline versus your timeline. And you can't build a funnel unless you do it internally. And a lot of times, even sometimes when you post a position, you only need one, you have 100 to choose from, you have a great funnel and database to pull from. So it's also a flywheel effect. With an internal team, you can build on work that's been previously done, unlike an external resource in which they have all the cards in their hands.
And I agree with you. When you have specialty roles, right, that's when you turn to a search firm, because you're not going to necessarily one-off type specialty roles, or sort of the 80-20 rule, right? The 20% that you're like, this is going to take 80% of my recruiter's time. Then you say, okay, let's go to the outside.
Yeah, and it also comes down to the level of employee. If you're looking for a C-suite or even a VP, sometimes the PE group, the C-suite, the executive leadership team, the CEO, they're not going to consider anything other than a more established name brand product to go with. And your team may not be set up for that because, like you said, the majority of 80, 90 even percent is very transactional positions.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up about PE firms. I'm seeing more and more. Some of these PE firms have centralized recruiting within the PE firm, so that the portcos can leverage that for their, say, VP level and above positions. Because you're right, what you're doing is you're competing against some big firms that, there's some Fortune 100 firms that are like, we do everything in-house, even the C-suite roles. So how do you compete against that? So I think that's really smart.
Well, the good thing is if you are backed by a PE group, especially a good one, they're more than anything else, they're a resource. Yes, they can be quite demanding because the company itself is an investment vehicle, but a lot of times they're a great resource and they want to be leveraged. And depending on PE group, how big they are, a lot of times that is a great resource. And that still does not prevent you or exclude having a great COE of talent acquisition yourself, but those are just for specialized needs.
Yeah. Do you have an example of maybe one time in your career that you've gotten pushed back on this topic?
Yes, when we were growing at U.S. Dermatology Partners, we just completed a bunch of M&A. The team was still pulling up its bootstraps. The team was built, but it was very much transactional. We had a need for regional managers and directors, and it was a toss-up whether or not we were going to go externally. What we eventually did and what I convinced the team to do is let's try it ourselves, give us a timetable, give us a window, and give us a quality standard for candidates. We'll present the profiles, build them all internally, which we did. And that actually worked probably 4 times out of 5. And if we couldn't find something, it was a different region or a location that's hard to fill, we would go externally. A lot of times we won the competitive battle from external to internal.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think that when recruiting is done well, all the rest of talent management becomes much easier, right? If you've got the right people in the pipeline, that you've got a robust enough pipeline, you've got a big enough slate to choose from, you're not just hiring the first person who applies, then everything else becomes much easier. So,
well, and once you have a team, you can optimize it, optimize the processes, optimize everything. So your time to fill is going to go lower and lower the longer you have a cohesive team together with proper processes and expectations.
Yeah, I know this is not exactly the topic that we're talking about objections and how to handle objections in-house, but what were some of those processes that you put in place? I know you're the master of efficiency and getting things to just hum along.
Well, what I always did was I had a CRM attached to my ATS, which fed directly into the rest of my HRIS system. So essentially, there were no gaps. There were no manual processes. Once somebody applied for a position, even if it was a director level or VP, we had them apply through the system. It allowed us faster access to all their information. And if we end up choosing those candidates, it flowed directly into the database itself. Now, that's become more of a standard today, but at the time it wasn't, or there were some gaps or time-based reasons why we couldn't sync the information. So it's a lot more consistent today. But in my last organization, we did use AI to help filtering and sorting. Of course, you have to be careful nowadays with state and federal regulations and the EEOC sometimes having a word about that. But we used AI as much as we could in the last organization. And it was actually more towards programmatic spend that actually pointed to our ATS and the open positions that we had. So we leveraged.
It was more to what?
It was more to move the programmatic spend that we had in certain areas so that anytime we saw a gap, the AI was actually pushing the spend to different positions and regions so that we knew that we're getting more optimal cost savings on what we were doing. And again, it was basically a coordinator of that spend.
Okay, so we're getting better results from Indeed versus LinkedIn. Let's keep pushing on this because it could see that there was more applicants coming through or more hires.
Or we had more requisitions in one region than another.
Okay. Was that integrated into your existing ATS
It
system?
was. It was
Mhm.
actually a bridge from an external partner, but it
Okay.
worked extremely well.
Okay. That's pretty cool.
Yep.
Yeah, because I remember the days of tracking all that stuff in a spreadsheet.
No, no.
Yeah.
And we were getting great results from that. And it
Yeah.
lowered the RI, it lowered the average time to fill, and it lowered the cost per hire.
That's awesome. That sounds like a whole episode in itself.
Yes, yes. And we had the applicant, we had the time to fill for typical positions down to 24 days.
Yeah. All right. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat for myself or Billy. Let's transition to career pathing. Okay, this is one that I'm really passionate about because I had to learn this lesson the hard way myself. And Billy, having been a past mastermind member, you know this story
Yeah.
of how I was that CEO that was like, why do we need so many levels? And I really prefer a much flatter organization. And, aren't people just getting opportunities? They seem to like where they work. But on the other hand, I had 50% turnover. So what do you
Right.
say to a CEO like me?
That we can get that down once you are very diligent in the way that you set up your career pathing. And a lot of times it goes much deeper than setting up career pathing. It starts all the way back to job titles.
Job
Mhm.
architecture. And
That's
yeah,
exactly, well, job titles, yeah, and architecture. So
yeah.
let me give you an example. In my last organization, iCare Partners, they had just completed a ton of M&A. They brought me in to clean it up. We had, for a 9,000 head count, we had 900 job titles. And you can't have career pathing with that many titles, obviously. It's a mixed bag. You have a lot of duplication, et cetera. So a lot of times before you can get to career pathing, you got to go back to the basics, streamline all those titles. That streamlining leads to consistently less titles. Then you make sure your job descriptions are up to snuff, assign those. And then from there, you look at your compensation structures. And then from there, you can go to career pathing because you've defined the career path based on the job descriptions, but also on the needs of the organization.
Yeah, at least you didn't say you had 9,000 employees and 9,001 job titles. I have heard of that too.
No. Now,
Before.
when you get to the corporate level, all bets are off.
Yeah. No, and in our case, we actually had pretty specific job titles. But for us, it was about just not knowing, the employees not knowing what was next for them, right? And the advisors that I had on my board at the time were CHROs, and they said, look, people like working here. They enjoy the work. They love their friends. They're getting great opportunities, but they just don't know what's next. And so literally our turnover went 50% down to 10% in 9 months as a result of putting career paths together. And then over the next probably 6 years, we were in single digits. And then we had lots of boomerangs come back because people were like, oh, I got promoted again, right? And
Yep.
this is a long time ago when like people like me were like, why did they need to get promoted every 6 months?
Right.
But I think you're right. It's more complicated than just putting a career path in place without the foundational elements, and that's a whole, other can of worms. How do you, what are the things that you can say to an executive to make them want to go through the pain of that whole process, right? It's not an easy thing for an organization to go through. Lots of change.
Well, the very first thing I always ask them, how did you get into the C-suite? You didn't magically appear there. You went through different phases of your career, right. And everyone wants to feel progress. Right. And when we do career pathing, I call it paths to progress. That's my little catchphrase for it because everyone wants a path. No matter what job they're doing, no matter how satisfied they are, they want to know it's leading to something. And you want to honor the institutional knowledge, the experience, and the efficiency and effectiveness of how long they've been in that role. Right. And you have to capture that because if you don't have them for the next step, you're going to lose them and you're going to have to recruit for that next step.
Yeah.
And then sometimes that's a mixed bag, as we know from the talent acquisition portion.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can fill them as fast as you can at the top, but if you're losing them on the back end, it's not helping. I mean, I think there's all sorts of hard numbers that people have quantified, like, you know, it's 1.5 times salary. I think it's much more if it's, you know, higher level positions. For sales, we used to say, you know, it wasn't just this year's revenue, but it's the cumulative revenue that you're losing down the line. So, so I think having this career path is important, but sometimes you run into challenges, right, with executives saying, well, why do we need so many levels? I mean, how do you, so once you know and you've diagnosed kind of like why this is happening, why there's either turnover or it's an issue that you just mentioned, how do you lay it out so it's simple for people, for non-HR folks to understand?
Well, first things I lay it out, I map out what I'm looking for first so that they can understand what I'm talking about. My typical career pathing starts with at least 2 channels, leadership and individual contributors, you know, expertise versus leadership, because not everybody wants to be a manager, not everybody should be.
Right.
So you map that out first and understand, hey, essentially there's value in these roles. And the longer we keep someone in the organization, the less costly it becomes, as you already mentioned. It's not just the institutional knowledge, but it's the ramp to get somebody new and the mixed bag, sometimes from external to internal. But I lay that out basically in a path type format, and I actually define the roles that I'm talking about and how they basically have a funnel effect, because you can get to the next layer most times from 4 or 5 different positions, depending on what it is. But you also want to map out the learning and development needs as well, which is why you define so clearly the job descriptions for the roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, it seems so simple, but yet people just like to create their own job descriptions depending on who they're hiring, right?
One of the ways that I solve for that, because everyone has an ego in a sense, especially when it comes to M&A, where you're pulling someone's title into someone else's group, and they're basically their point of view is that job is not exactly what I do. Especially at U.S. Dermatology Partners, we had medical assistants, but we had different versions of them. Essentially, for the bureaucracy in the administration of that role, a medical assistant is a medical assistant for the most part.
Right.
However, what I used was supplemental job descriptions. So anytime I had a primary job description for the role, and anytime I needed some variance, I created a supplemental job description that was a plus or minus from the main role. That way we could capture their skills and necessities and even give them a slightly altered title, but in the system, it's a medical assistant.
Right. I love the supplemental, right? Because then your core framework follows the main job description.
That's
but
right.
Then I love how you approach that. Then people can kind of design their own, right?
That's exactly right. And we curtailed that as well, because again, you still have to keep up with that. But for specialized roles, especially depending on the company, whether it's founder-led, PE-backed, or if you have M&A through a very strong local culture that you acquired, sometimes you have to have some kind of bin built into the system. But when it comes right down to it, that medical assistant has opportunities at the next level, the same as everybody else does.
Yeah. I also think setting those expectations perhaps before the deal goes down, because I've heard so many CHROs who get stuck with, well, this was part of the deal. This is what we said to the owners that, you know, of the acquiring company, that they would get to keep it this way. And another reason why HR needs to be involved earlier than later.
As I explained to my previous CEOs, early and often, about as close as the business development group is and ops, we need to be in there maybe even beforehand to start doing the analysis, and to make sure that nothing is promised that we can't deliver.
Yeah. It's on the back end can be a nightmare. So
yes.
Well, good. Well, Billy, thanks for all of that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're going to be well served if you set your processes up effectively on the front side and make sure that whatever is promised through HR, not just ops and business development.
Yeah. It's a lesson sometimes companies have to learn the hard way, though.
That's right.
Okay, well, Billy, thank you for this. I want to just make sure that if you're interested in reading all of the different objections, we've got, the objections, we've got the metrics that you can point to, we've got the way you can say it to the C-suite in a document in CHROschool.com. So if you haven't already signed up for CHROschool.com, it's a free resource. Feel free to go in and pull up the PDF. I think it's in Module 3 under Repositioning HR, and let us know what you think. So in the next weeks, we'll be going through more of these. But Billy, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge you and just tell you that I really appreciate how your brain works, like as far as systems and processes. And I think that in today's world, more and more CHROs are going to need to think the way you think because of AI. So I know I can't have an episode without talking about AI, but I think as I'm going through trying to leverage some of these AI tools internally, I realize that it feels like I'm going through a whole systems implementation, right? It's not a new system, but having to document everything and make sure that it gets out of my brain and onto paper. And you are a master at that. How maybe just one tip for the audience on how they can think more systems thinking.
Well, first of all, my motto is, if it's not broke, then you're not looking hard enough.
Okay.
And most senior leadership and PE groups appreciate that perspective. You never want to rest on your coattails.
Mm-hmm.
But everything can be polished, everything can be improved, or if necessary, RFP'd and replaced. It really comes down to how effective it is. You can throw raw energy at it like people or fingers. But my also stand is, anytime there's fingers involved, there's errors that you're going to embed. So take as many fingers out of the process as possible. Remove the gaps of either information from communication or education and the people involved in those processes. Streamline as much as possible. No one wakes up at the beginning of a day and says, I can't wait to look like a fool by messing up at work. So our roles as leaders, especially in processes, is, again, take those gaps out. Don't have someone make a decision that they shouldn't be making to begin with. And if the process is streamlined enough and there's connectivity where it should be, then you're not going to have to worry about it. Like, for instance, when I mentioned, when someone fills out an applicant tracking system and that's the beginning of their information, they put it in, not us. That reduces errors because they're the most familiar with their information. So it's mentalities like that. And I don't just replace things just to replace them, because sometimes that can be very costly. At the same time, most HRIS or tech stacks are simply not being optimized or used to the fullest extent. Modules are not being turned on, and they're not being used to the extent that you could.
Yeah, no, I hear about that all the time, right? Like, they're so exhausted after the implementation,
Yeah.
that nobody's leveraging all the different modules that they actually have paid for. So I think your skill set is going to be so valuable in this AI era that we're into right now.
Well, I appreciate that. Plus, feedback from the front lines and the stakeholders. Any negative criticisms is an opportunity to look at a process or a platform that's not working effectively for somebody. And I usually do quarterly reviews anyway on processes and platforms, and alter as much as I can along the way. It's a change management exercise more than anything else.
Okay.
But that has to be done at least once a quarter.
Okay, so we only have one more minute, but tell me real quick, what does that quarterly process review look like?
That is taking all the input first from the executive leadership team, all of the functional COEs outside of HR, and asking the critical questions: what's working, what's not.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they can help us pinpoint what part of our system they're not satisfied with, or the output, or the efficiency or effectiveness, that's going to give me a leg up as far as where I'm going into looking at what platform or process that needs to be reviewed.
So it sounds like your scope was well beyond HR. It was.
I tried as much as possible to make it so, yes.
Yeah. All right. Billy, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today. And I know you're in the market for a new CHRO opportunity. So
Yep.
you guys feel free to reach out and help Billy make some connections. And I think if you have some process challenges, he'd be a great guy to brainstorm with. All right.
Happy to help.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Billy. This is
All right.
Cindy Lou with CHRO Partners. We'll see you next time.